Lila Krasnicki lived in a small but well-appointed house, and the rain tapped relentlessly against its windows. She had always taken great satisfaction in her well-chosen life, carefully juggling her position as the dutiful wife to her husband, Samuel, with her career as successful antiques dealer. Their marriage seemed flawless, a union founded on mutual respect, common goals, and, above all, confidence. But as with many facades, the illusion concealed the truth, a festering secret about which a web of obsession, treachery, and murder would shortly be spun. All started with a whisper, a brief remark from a close friend during a gathering that set off Samuel's mental alarms. Samuel brushed it off at first, but once the seed of doubt was planted, it started to grow, feeding off the smallest discrepancies in Lila's behavior. The friend had said casually, "Lila seems to be spending an awful lot of time at that new gym she joined." Although Lila had always been conscientious about her exercise, lately her dedication to her gym visits had become almost compulsive. Claiming she wanted to avoid the throngs, she would leave early in the morning and return late, flushed and radiant, in a manner Samuel had not seen in years. It was more than just the time she spent away. It was the little changes he observed, new perfumes she had never worn before, a more appealing choice of workout clothing, and the way she would slip off into her own thoughts, a secret smile playing on her lips. Samuel's mistrust set him on a path that would upend his life as known. Samuel gently grabbed Lila's phone one evening while she was in the shower. His heart thumping as he unlocked it, he discovered in the messages what he dreaded, a thread of texts between Lila and a contact saved as Coach. The intimate, flirtatious messages included plans to meet outside of the gym. One message caught my attention, a strategy to spend the next weekend at a remote retreat far from curious onlookers. Soon Samuel discovered the coach was Tomasz Novak. After an injury cut off his career, Tomasz, a former competitive bodybuilder, had entered personal training. He was a tall man with a magnetic quality that demanded attention in any kind of venue. Mostly wealthy women ready to pay a premium for the privilege of his undivided attention made up his customer base. Tomasz was known for producing results, but he also had a reputation for being overly close to his clients. Rumors of his extracurricular activities had surfaced, but nothing had ever been confirmed. Samuel sensed his universe falling apart. Unable to face Lila personally, he paid a private investigator to follow Tomasz and her. The proof arrived fast. Pictures of the two at romantic dinners, hand-in-hand walks in parks, and lastly, a set of images from the weekend retreat, verifying the affair beyond any doubt. Tomasz's whole background, his failed marriage, his history of brief relationships with clients, and a run of financial problems that seemed to follow him everywhere, was included in the investigator's final report. Samuel's sanity was being attacked by knowledge of Lila's betrayal. Thoughts of retribution consumed him. Every waking moment he imagined ways to make both pay for the humiliation they had brought about. Samuel was a neat man, though, and he understood that every action he took had to be as flawless as the life he had formerly imagined. Though they were dark, his developing ideas were exact. A few weeks later, Lila vanished under report. Clearly disturbed, Samuel convincingly portrayed the grieving husband to perfection, fooling friends, relatives, and law enforcement of his hopelessness. He said she left early one morning and never came back, launching a full-scale hunt. Supporting Samuel, the community gathered prayers for Lila's safe return. But for several months, Lila's body would not be located. Half buried in a deep forest bordering a private estate several miles from their house, it was a hiker who came upon her bones. The authorities were called, and the terrible chore of identification started. Lila's once vibrant face was now hardly discernible, and her body suggested a fierce struggle. She had obviously not died rapidly. To project the time of death, forensic entomologists were brought in to examine the insect activity on her remains. Lila had been dead for almost as long as she had been missing, her body left to the care of the elements in a terrible ending. Her remains changed the case from a missing person search to a homicide, and the hunt for her killer started in real force. Led by the methodical detective Harlan Oberoi, the detectives rapidly focused on Tomasz. His phone records put him close to the scene of Lila's body discovery at the time of her death, and his financial records revealed an odd increase in his expenditure soon following. Tomasz insisted under great interrogation that he would never hurt Lila, even though he had an affair with her. But his alibi was weak. Thus, the growing circumstantial evidence led him to be the main suspect. But the path darkened as the inquiry dug further. Samuel, who had been so convincing in his bereavement, was beginning to fall apart under examination. His narrative was full of contradictions, odd coincidences impossible to overlook, and a progressively unsettling picture of a man silently simmering in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to strike. The narrative of Lila's disappearance and the murder that followed promised to expose a truth far more twisted than anyone could have dreamed. Detective Harlan Oberoi became caught in a web of lies that transcended the seeming love affair between Lila and Tomasz as the inquiry dug further. Samuel's first portrayal of the heartbroken husband was starting to phrase at the margins. Every interview he conducted, every tear he shed, seemed too deliberate, too exact, as though practiced. Having spent more than 2 decades working as a detective, Harlan had seen firsthand that grief was never so precisely contained. The case's turning point came when Tomasz's gym was searched by police looking at a tip from an unidentified caller. Tucked inside a locker designated for him, they discovered a little blood-stained cloth and a bracelet later identified as belonging to Lila. Already under observation, Tomasz was arrested right there. Once calm and confident, the gym trainer collapsed under interrogation. But his innocence claims endured. Admitting the affair, he vividly detailed how Lila had found comfort in his arms and characterized their relationship as one based on mutual need. But he insisted she was alive the last time he saw her and swore he had nothing to do with her murder. Tomasz denied it, but the data appeared damning. Still, the issue was far from closed. The instincts of Detective Oberoi sensed something unusual. He struggled to match Tomasz's seeming love for Lila with the cruel nature of her death. Moreover, Tomasz's sudden financial windfall, the pricey car, the extravagant dinners, did not fit the profile of a man preparing a quick escape after a murder. It seemed overly obvious, too simple. Harlan examined the data with fresh eyes, paying close attention to the financial records that had before been written off as just circumstantial in an effort to probe further. Not long after Lila passed away, Tomasz received a sizable payment into his account. Originally supposed to be payment for personal training, what suddenly seemed more sinister. The money came from a shell company, which Samuel Krasnicki was connected to following some research. As it happened, Samuel was not the straightforward antiques seller he seemed to be. Renowned for trading rare and costly goods, his company was a front for a far darker enterprise. For years, he had been washing money for different criminal groups, using his respectable company to clean contaminated cash. She had confronted him, threatening to reveal everything, when Lila found his secret. Samuel, on the other hand, was a man who lived on control and could not afford to lose all he had created. As Harlan's team started to piece together the chronology, they found Samuel had painstakingly scheduled to eradicate Lila and Tomasz, using the affair as a smokescreen. Long before Samuel came upon the text messages, he knew about the affair. Knowing it would provide the ideal cover for his own evil scheme, he had specifically let it go on. Samuel's scheme was shockingly deliberate. Make Tomasz appear as a man driven to kill by passion, while he, the bereaved husband, would walk away unharmed, inheriting Lila's large fortune and silence, the one person who could destroy him. The breakthrough came when forensic accountants followed the money trail back to a private investigator Samuel had hired to compile evidence on Tomasz. Samuel had hired him before. Now, under pressure, the investigator came forward with an astonishing confession. Samuel paid him to place evidence in Tomasz's gym, so guaranteeing that the affair would be revealed and Tomasz would be linked to the murder. Part of the arrangement were the blood-stained cloth and Lila's bracelet, carefully positioned to guarantee Tomasz's collapse. Harlan faced Samuel armed with this fresh knowledge. Harlan laid out the evidence piece by piece in silence, except from the ticking of a clock in the interrogation room. For the first time, Samuel displayed flimsy control. Of course, he denied everything, but as the weight of the data fell on him, his demonstrations became less forceful. In a last-ditch effort to prove his innocence, Samuel said the money transfers were a result of a legal business agreement unrelated to Lila's death. But his narrative lacked resonance. His own lies grew more entwined the more he spoke. The detectives pushed him harder, disclosing that they had also discovered traces of Lila's blood in Samuel's trunk, blood that forensic experts verified had been cleaned, but not sufficiently enough to avoid discovery. Samuel's defense collapsed in face of the overwhelming data. At last, he admitted, not out of guilt, but rather in a cold, detached manner, as if he were reporting a business transaction instead of the murder of his wife. He went into great detail about how he had controlled the circumstances so that, although he would walk away unharmed and free to carry on his illegal activities, all fingers would point to Tomasz. Samuel, though, had undervalued the tenacity of Detective Oberoi and his staff. The well-constructed story Samuel had spun came apart to expose the monster hiding under the mask of the bereaved widower. Though guilty of adultery, Tomasz was cleared of the murder accusations. His life was permanently damaged by the ordeal, but at least he was free from the possibility of incarceration. The weight of Samuel's crimes, now fully revealed as he was being transported in handcuffs, shocked the community that had once pitied him. Although the actual trial was that of the human soul, that struggle between love and obsession, control and freedom, life and death, the trial would shortly start. Not only from his crimes, but also from his underestimating of the power of truth and justice, Samuel Krasnicki had lost everything. Still, the shadows of his activities would linger long after the trial, torment people caught in his lethal game. The narrative was far from finished, and Samuel's actions would reverberate across the life of every person engaged as the wheels of justice started to spin. Samuel Krasnicki's trial turned into a media extravaganza, attracting a lot of attention for its shocking turns and cold-blooded character of his crimes. Reporters, sketch artists, and onlookers, eager to see the man who had planned such a horrific scheme, were abound in the courtroom. Still in shock over her death, Lila's family sat in the front row every day, their faces marked with a mix of loss and a demand for justice. Under the unrelenting attorney Nadia Haverford, the prosecution put a strong case against Samuel. They painstakingly arranged the data that Detective Oberoi and his colleagues had acquired to create a picture of a man driven to do the ultimate betrayal by his need for control and anxiety of losing his empire. "This is not just a case of murder," Nadia said in opening remarks, setting the tone for the trial. "It's a case of manipulation, avarice, and the cold computation of a man thinking he could get away with anything." The prosecution's approach was to highlight Samuel's deliberate nature of behavior. They called a number of professional witnesses to the stand, including the forensic entomologist, who detailed Lila's death chronology based on insect activity on her remains, and the forensic accountant, who explained how the money was passed through shell companies. But the most damning evidence came from the private investigator Samuel hired to place evidence against Tomasz. Samuel's confession in court was the last nail in his coffin, so establishing his guilt without any doubt. Tomasz Novak stood up as well. He had been unfairly accused. He talked about his relationship with Lila, owning to the affair but keeping his innocence about her death. Though he expressed regret for the suffering he had brought about, his testimony was emotional and focused on Samuel's manipulation of him. As Tomasz broke down, the jury saw how Samuel had exploited his shortcomings to become a pawn in a lethal game. For the jury, Tomasz's testimony humanized him from the villain he had been presented as into another victim of Samuel's merciless plans. Conversely, the defense battled to refute the overwhelming proof. Gregory Polanski, Samuel's seasoned but clearly tired attorney, tried to challenge the prosecution's story by implying that Samuel had been framed by rivals inside his business network and that the evidence was circumstantial. But under cross-examination, this line of protection soon fell apart since Samuel's own behavior had brought him down. Samuel seemed to be a man, frantically grabbing at straws. The more the defense sought to assign blame, Samuel stayed austere throughout the trial, his face unreadable. Apart from consulting his lawyer, he hardly spoke and never once expressed regret. His behavior simply helped to alienate him even farther from the public and the jury. The courtroom replayed the coldness with which he had described Lila's murder during his confession, so supporting the picture of a man who considered others as only tools to be used and thrown aside. Nadia Haverford gave a strong last argument as the trial drew to an end. She exhorted the jury to reject the falsehoods and manipulations and to see the man who had planned such a horrible crime for his actual nature. "Samuel Krasnicki is not a victim," she said, her voice ringing across the courtroom. "He is a predator, a man who thought he could effortlessly rule the life of others. But we answer him in this courtroom. We bring justice for Lila, for Tomasz, and for every person whose life he sought to eradicate." Before rendering a decision, the jury debated for little under 4 hours. As the foreman stood to deliver the ruling, the courtroom felt charged. "We discover Samuel Krasnicki, the defendant, guilty on all counts." The onlookers gasped audibly. Then Lila's family released a wave of relief. Still devoid of emotions, Samuel accepted the decision without response. He was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole, so guaranteeing that he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, paying for the lives he had destroyed. Tomasz Novak sought to reconstruct his life following the trial, but the stigma around his participation in the scandal persisted. Even though he had been cleared, the affair and the media coverage that followed had damaged his career and personal life. Seeking anonymity somewhere where nobody knew his name or past, he left the city. The encounter had transformed him. He was now reluctant to rely on others and tormented by the part he had unintentionally contributed to Lila's death. Although the decision brought some degree of closure for Lila's family, the loss's agony persisted. Inspired by her name and committed to helping victims of domestic violence and those caught in the web of controlling relationships, they laid a foundation in her name, hoping that her sad tale might save others from a like fate. Knowing that justice had been done, Detective Harlan Oberoi went back to work, knowing that the scars this case left would linger. This case had tested his will, challenged him, and strengthened his conviction in the search of truth, no matter how far it was buried. Regarding Samuel, a man who had once governed so much, he disappeared into the anonymity of the prison system, a man reduced to a number in a cell. His life of influence and control had come to an end, leaving just the broken lives of people he had sought to rule. Samuel Krasnicki's fall from grace served as a sobering reminder that ultimately the truth always finds a way out from the shadows and demands justice, no matter how hard one tries to control the story. Years passed following the trial, but public memory of Lila Krasnicki and the man behind her death never really faded. The events that had happened permanently changed the people directly involved, even as the media turned on fresh scandals and tragedies, not only on those who were immediately connected, but on an entire community that had watched in shock as a story of love, betrayal, and murder played out in the most brutal fashion. The narrative had left deep scars. Once a vibrant and aspirational personal trainer, Tomasz Novak led a quiet life in a small town where his name had little bearing. He had opened a small fitness center, serving a small number of customers ignorant of his background. Though he was trying to start over, Lila's death loomed big over all he did. He steered clear of close relationships, his faith in others permanently tarnished. Haunted by dreams of that era, he frequently found himself staring at the walls of his tiny apartment, wondering if he could ever really move past the past. In one of his recurrent dreams, he would relive the moment he found Lila's bracelet buried in his locker, the anxiety that had engulfed him when the cops stormed his gym, the sense of his world collapsing all around him, the memory of Lila herself, their brief interactions that, in the end, had been nothing more than a prelude to a dream run through by a man they both undervalued, tormented him most. Lila's family directed their loss into their foundation, which had expanded into a sizable company. By means of it, they provided persons caught in abusive and controlling relationships both legal and emotional support. Lila's legacy became the basis. She was a lighthouse of hope, born of tragedy. Though the void left by their daughter's death could never be filled, her parents, especially, found comfort in serving others. Often visiting her grave, a simple headstone in a peaceful cemetery, they spoke to her as though she were still alive, updating her on the foundation's activities and the lives they had touched in her name. Detective Harlan Oberoi carried on his work, although he never worked on a case as closely as the Krasniqi inquiry. Recognized for his keen instincts and relentless commitment to justice, he was raised to a higher level within the force. But the case helped him to better grasp the human psyche, of how love, when distorted by obsession and control, might produce the most horrible of deeds. Always wary of the secret depths in those he questioned, he would find himself thinking back on the case and using its lessons to guide him through fresh investigations. Once a very powerful man, Samuel Krasniqi adjusted to his new life behind bars, using the same cold efficiency he had displayed in his past interactions. He stayed to himself, deftly negotiating the cruel hierarchy of the prison system by means of intelligence and cunning, so creating a niche where he could live. But he carried great weight from the solitude, the grim reality of prison life, where he was merely another inmate, helpless and ignored, now replaced the control he once possessed. Though Samuel tried to keep his cool, the guilt and shame from his behavior ate at him. In the silence before sleep, the faces of those he had betrayed, Lila, Tomasz, even the gullible members of the society who had once loved him, haunted him. Although Samuel had always taken great satisfaction in his capacity to outsmart and outmaneuver others, ultimately, the very forces he thought he could control had outdone him. It was a painful pill to chew when he realized his life would end inside a prison cell, with nothing to show for all his efforts. One of the few people Samuel spoke with, the prison psychologist, pointed out the simmering, deep-seated resentment and guilt under his austere appearance. Samuel started opening more about the reasons behind his activities over time. Although his sessions were few, he talked of his need to control every element of his life, his anxiety of losing everything he had created, and how Lila's threat to reveal him had set off something sinister inside him, a fear so strong that it eclipsed any moral sense. Even in these admissions, though, there was no indication of true regret, only a strong conviction that he had been wronged by an environment that would not change to suit his will. The psychologist came to believe Samuel was beyond recovery because of this lack of real confession. His was a mind too firmly anchored in its own story to ever fully appreciate the scope of his atrocities. The narrative of Samuel Krasniqi vanished into the annals of criminal history as the years passed, a warning about how love, when twisted by obsession and control, might have terrible results. The people who knew Lila recalled her as a gentle, energetic woman whose life had been cut short by the darkness she had unintentionally discovered. Her memory persisted in the hearts of people who had loved her, as well as in the Foundation. Ultimately, Lila Krasniqi's case served as a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most ideal lives, there can be hidden secrets ready to ruin everything. For those who survived, the echoes of the past shaped their futures in ways they never could have predicted, and they carried with them the delicate line separating the two, and the lessons of love's ability for both light and darkness as they each progressed. Samuel Krasniqi's once mechanical mind started to wane in the twilight of his years. The solitude and the unrelenting passage of time took their toll, degrading the sharpness that had once made him a powerful weapon in his world of dishonesty and manipulation. He spent his days in the boring prison schedule, his once perfect appearance now diminished to the run-down gray uniform of an inmate. Once he possessed, his power was now only a memory, dulled by the reality of his situation. Samuel's health started to fast deteriorate in his last years of life. He was given a terminal diagnosis. His body betrayed him in the same manner he had betrayed people closest to him. The once proud man withers away, his stoic attitude gradually giving way to the frailty of age and illness as the prison wardens watch. Samuel lacked family to grieve his approaching death and visitors. Everyone he had alienated now found solace in the walls of his cell. Samuel was moved to the prison infirmary as his illness got worse, where he stayed under the medical staff's care for his last days. Once tried to reach him, the psychologist visited sporadically, more out of professional obligation than any actual expectation of change. But Samuel changed in these last days. His sharp edges of personality seemed to soften, not out of regret, but rather from the weariness that follows knowing the end is near. Samuel asked to see the psychologist one last time one evening as the sun set outside his window, throwing long shadows across the clean infirmary walls. Though unusual, the request was approved. Middle-aged woman with a patient attitude, the psychologist came into the room, dragging a chair close to Samuel's bed. Samuel, whose voice now was a whisper, told of the ghosts he was tormented. He discussed Lila, about how her learning of his secrets had set off the series of events culminating in her death. Even in his last hours, though, he was only deeply bitter about how his life had collapsed so totally. Not really regretful about what he had done, he talked of the desperation to keep control over his life, the anxiety that had driven him, and how that desperation had sent him down a road with no turnaround. The psychologist listened silently, knowing that this was the last thoughts of a man whose life was nearing total solitude, rather than a confession in the conventional sense. She provided no solace or absolution, only the quiet presence of someone ready to hear Samuel's story come to an end. A few days later, Samuel Krasnicki passed away, asleep. His death was not unusual. It was only noted in the prison records and by the attending medical staff members. No funeral, and no one to claim his body. He lay in a basic tomb in the prison cemetery, only distinguished by a number. Once controlling so much, the man had left the planet empty. Samuel's death brought a last sense of closure, but not peace, for people he had wronged. Using their own tragedy as a lighthouse of hope, Lila's family carried on their work across the foundation, helping others break free from the grip of controlling relationships. They knew that the problems Samuel was representing, the need for control, the capacity for betrayal, would still influence others, even now he was gone. Their goal thus became even more important, since it guarantees that Lila's legacy would be one of empowerment and encouragement of people in need. Having learned of Samuel's death via a news item, Tomasz Novak experienced a range of conflicting feelings. The death of the man who had tried to destroy him brought only a somber awareness that the chapter of his life connected to Lila's death was at last closed. Though the wounds of the past would always exist, Tomasz had started to let people back into his life. Though he knew he could never completely run away from what had happened, he could decide how he would spend his remaining years. Finding comfort in the basic routines that anchored him, he chose to keep working in fitness, helping others reach their objectives. Long after Samuel's death, Detective Harlan Oberoi, too, sensed the echoes of the case. He had gone on to other studies, each one difficult in its own right, but none as personally poignant as the Krasnicki case. Harlan knew that justice had been done, but he also knew that people like Samuel, those who felt they could control others with impunity, were abound in the world. It was a sobering idea that made him realize the value of his work and the need of discovering the truth, regardless of its depth of buriedness. Ultimately, the narrative of Samuel Krasnicki, Lila Krasnicki, and Tomasz Novak turned into a warning story, a reminder of the terrible force of obsession and the extent some would go to preserve control. Those who had been touched by it carried a dark chapter that had at last come to an end inside their hearts. Lila's name grew to be associated with the work of the foundation as the years went by. Her memory lived in the innumerable lives the company helped to transform. Though sad, her story had produced something good, a legacy that guaranteed her life and even her death had significance. And thus the world continued in the silence of the prison cemetery under the unmarked tomb of Samuel Krasnicki. The last reckoning had arrived, changing the planet irrevocably by the decisions one man made and the results that followed. Finally, the shadows of the past had been laid to rest, and a fresh dawn, with hope for a better, brighter future, arose in their place.